Human history is filled with moments where the impossible became possible, where ordinary people faced unimaginable challenges and, against all odds, found a way to survive. Picture this: you're standing alone in a vast, unforgiving wilderness with nothing but your wits to keep you alive. No modern tools, no technology, no safety net. Just you and the raw, untamed forces of nature. Now imagine that same scenario playing out thousands of years ago, when the stakes were even higher and the margins for error razor thin. These aren't just hypotheticals, they're the real, pulse-pounding stories of ancient survivors who stared down disaster and refused to back down. From the frozen tundras to scorching deserts, from the depths of the ocean to the heart of besieged cities, the tales we're about to explore are more than just historical footnotes. They're testaments to the unbreakable human spirit, proof that courage, ingenuity, and sheer determination can triumph over even the most dire circumstances. Think about the lost explorer who navigated uncharted lands with nothing but the stars to guide them, or the city that held out against overwhelming odds, its people clinging to hope when all seemed lost. These stories aren't just about survival, they're about the resilience that defines us as a species. So why do these ancient survival stories still captivate us today? Because they speak to something deep within all of us, the primal instinct to endure, to adapt, and to overcome. They remind us that no matter how advanced our world becomes, the lessons of the past still hold power. In this video, we'll journey through 25 of history's most astonishing survival feats, each one more incredible than the last. You'll meet the unsung heroes who defied the odds, the ingenious strategies that turned certain doom into triumph, and the moments where humanity's will to survive shone brightest. Get ready to be inspired, amazed, and maybe even a little humbled, because these stories aren't just about the past. They're about what we're all capable of when pushed to our limits. The story of the Lost Legion of Carrhae is one of history's most haunting mysteries, a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the year 53 BCE, a Roman army led by the ambitious general Crassus marched into the heart of Parthian territory, confident in their military might. But what followed was a disaster. Outmaneuvered and overwhelmed, the Romans suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Carrie, with thousands slain or captured. Among the chaos, however, whispers persisted that not all were lost. Legends tell of a band of 10,000 soldiers who, rather than surrender or perish, vanished into the vast deserts of the east. Cut off from Rome, surrounded by hostile lands, and stripped of supplies, these men faced a nightmare scenario. The desert offered no mercy: scorching days, freezing nights, and endless stretches of barren landscape. Yet somehow they endured. Some accounts suggest they adapted to their new reality, learning to navigate the unforgiving terrain, bartering with local tribes, or even blending into foreign societies. Others claim they became mercenaries, trading their skills for survival. What's certain is that their resilience defied all expectations. But how did they do it? Imagine the sheer willpower it took to keep moving when every step could be your last. No supply lines, no reinforcements, just the determination to live another day. Historians debate their fate, with some theories suggesting they wandered as far as China, leaving traces of Roman influence in distant lands. Whether myth or reality, their story captures the essence of survival, adaptability, ingenuity, and an unbreakable spirit. This wasn't just about escaping death. It was about refusing to let the desert or their enemies erase them from history. And so, the legend of the Lost Legion endures, a gripping reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity finds a way to persevere. High atop a barren plateau in the Judean desert, a fortress stood as the last defiant symbol of resistance against an empire that ruled the known world. The siege of Masada in 73 CE wasn't just a military standoff, it was a clash of wills, a test of human resolve pushed to its absolute limit. 960 Jewish rebels, including men, women, and children, had taken refuge on this remote mountaintop, their backs against the wall as the mighty Roman 10th Legion closed in around them. For months they watched as the Romans built an enormous siege ramp, inch by agonizing inch, knowing it was only a matter of time before the end came. But what's truly staggering isn't just their defiance, it's the chilling choice they made when defeat became inevitable. When the walls finally fell, the Romans stormed the fortress expecting a bloody last stand. Instead, they found silence. The rebels had chosen mass suicide rather than surrender, a decision so extreme it still echoes through history. Yet amid this tragedy, a sliver of hope remained. 2 women and 5 children had hidden themselves, surviving to tell the tale. Their account, passed down through the historian Josephus, gives us a window into the unthinkable. What does it take to cling to life when even death seems preferable? These survivors didn't just escape physically, they carried the weight of memory, ensuring the world would know the courage and desperation of those who refused to be broken. Think about the sheer psychological toll of those final days, trapped in a desert stronghold with no hope of rescue, watching an unstoppable force methodically dismantle your last refuge. The rebels could have surrendered, accepting slavery or execution. Instead, they chose control over their own fate, an act of defiance so profound it still resonates today. But the survivors, they represent something equally powerful, the indomitable will to live, even when everything screams to give up. Their story forces us to ask, where does resilience come from in the face of certain doom? Masada isn't just a tale of endings. It's a story about the extremes of the human spirit, the razor's edge between despair and determination. The rebels' final act was one of tragic agency, but the survivors' escape reminds us that even in the darkest moments, life finds a way. Their whispered testimony, handed down across centuries, turns a military defeat into something immortal, a lesson about the price of freedom and the unyielding grip of hope. The story of Alvar Nunez's Cabeza de Vaca and his shipwrecked crew reads like something ripped from the pages of an epic adventure novel, except every harrowing twist is true. In 1528, a Spanish expedition set sail for the Gulf Coast, aiming to colonize Florida. But disaster struck when violent storms dashed their ships against the shore, leaving 300 men stranded in an unfamiliar, hostile land. Hunger, disease, and clashes with indigenous tribes whittled their numbers down to just 4 survivors. Among them, Cabeza de Vaca emerged as an unlikely leader, guiding his companions through an 8-year odyssey that would test the limits of human endurance. At first, survival meant submission. Captured by native tribes, the Spaniards were enslaved, forced into backbreaking labor with little food or mercy. But here's where their story takes a remarkable turn. Instead of resisting or despairing, Cabeza de Vaca observed, learned, and adapted. He studied the languages, customs, and healing practices of the tribes, transforming himself from a prisoner into a revered figure. Word spread of the strangers who could cure the sick, and soon they were welcomed as spiritual guides. This wasn't just survival, it was reinvention. The very people who once saw them as threats now saw them as healers, even protectors. Think about the sheer mental flexibility this required. These men had to shed their identity as conquistadors and embrace roles they'd never imagined. Cabeza de Vaca's accounts describe how they blended European and indigenous remedies, using prayer and practical medicine to treat ailments. Their reputation grew so powerful that tribes escorted them safely across thousands of miles, from present-day Texas to northern Mexico. Along the way, they became bridges between worlds, witnessing the vast diversity of Native American cultures long before most Europeans ever would. But their greatest legacy wasn't just their endurance, it was their empathy. Unlike many explorers of their time, Cabeza de Vaca returned to Spain with a radical message that indigenous peoples were not savages, but sophisticated societies deserving of respect. His writings challenged the brutal colonial mindset, offering one of the earliest European records of Native American life. In a time when survival often meant domination, these men chose understanding. Their journey proves that sometimes the key to outlasting the impossible isn't force, it's the courage to change, to listen, and to find common ground in the most unexpected places. High in the icy peaks of the Ertstal Alps, a discovery so extraordinary it rewrote history lay hidden for millennia. In 1991, two hikers stumbled upon what they thought was a fallen mountaineer, only to realize they'd found a time traveler from the distant past. Ertzi, the ice mummy, had been frozen in place for over 5,300 years, his body, tools, and even his last meal perfectly preserved by nature's deep freeze. This wasn't just an archaeological find, it was a window into the daily struggles of a Copper Age survivor, a man who'd battled the elements with nothing but primitive tools and sheer grit. What makes Ertzi's story so remarkable isn't just his preservation, it's the snapshot of survival his body provides. His clothing, stitched together from animal hides and woven grass, reveals a mastery of resourcefulness. His shoes, lined with bear fur for insulation, show an intimate understanding of the brutal alpine environment. Even his toolkit, a finely crafted copper axe, a flint knife, and a fire-starting kit, speaks to the ingenuity required to endure in a world without modern comforts. But perhaps the most haunting clue lies in his stomach. Scientists analyzing his final meal found traces of wild goat meat, grains, and even toxic fern spores, suggesting he'd eaten in desperation, knowing the risks. Then there's the mystery of his death. Ertzi didn't succumb to cold or starvation, he was murdered. An arrowhead lodged in his shoulder, deep cuts on his hands, and traces of blood from multiple people tell a story of violence. Was he fleeing enemies, ambushed on a mountain pass? The evidence paints a picture of a man who survived the wilderness, only to fall victim to human conflict. Yet even in death, Ertzi triumphed. His body, preserved like a message in a bottle, forced us to rethink everything we knew about prehistoric life. Consider the resilience it took to thrive in such a world. Ertzi wasn't just passing through the Alps, he was prepared. His belongings suggest he was a shepherd, a trader, or perhaps a shaman, familiar with the land's dangers. His tattoos, etched over joints possibly to relieve pain, hint at early medicinal knowledge. This wasn't a primitive man stumbling through the snow. This was a survivor, equipped with generations of hard-won wisdom. His story forces us to ask, how much of our modern survival instinct is inherited from ancestors like Ertzi, who turned adversity into an art form? The ice mummy's legacy isn't just about the past. It's a mirror reflecting our own capacity to adapt. In an age of climate-controlled homes and grocery stores, Ertzi's world feels alien. Yet his struggles finding food, shelter, safety are universal. His body, frozen in time, reminds us that survival isn't just about brute strength. It's about observation, creativity, and the relentless will to keep moving forward. 5 millennia later, Ertzi's greatest lesson endures. Even alone on a mountain, facing impossible odds, the human spirit leaves its mark. The Arctic has always been a realm of extremes, a place where the line between legend and reality blurs like the horizon in a snowstorm. And no story embodies that mystery more than the haunting fate of the Franklin expedition. In 1845, 129 men set sail under Sir John Franklin's command, determined to conquer the elusive Northwest Passage. Their ships, the Erebus and Terror, were marvels of Victorian engineering, stocked with years of supplies and the finest equipment of the age. Yet within months, they vanished without a trace, swallowed whole by the ice. Decades of searches turned up only grim clues, frozen graves, abandoned camps, and cryptic notes hinting at starvation, scurvy, and desperation. But one account, passed down by Inuit elders, offers a glimmer of something extraordinary, a whisper of a lone survivor who outlasted them all. According to Inuit oral history, years after the expedition disappeared, a single white man was seen living among a remote tribe, frail but alive. He spoke of ships crushed by ice, of men succumbing to cold and hunger, and of his own improbable journey across the tundra. Some historians believe this could have been Lieutenant John Irving, whose medal was later found in an Inuit settlement. Others think it might have been a different crew member, or even a composite of multiple encounters blended into legend over time. What's undeniable is the raw power of the story, a man stripped of civilization, forced to rely on the very people his mission had dismissed, adapting to a world that had claimed his comrades. Picture the sheer isolation of his existence. While the rest of the expedition perished, this one man somehow found refuge, trading his knowledge for survival. The Inuit, masters of the Arctic, would have taught him to hunt seals, build snow shelters, and navigate the endless white. In return, he might have shared stories of distant lands or the workings of his strange tools. It's a tantalizing thought, a cultural exchange born not from diplomacy but from sheer necessity. The Arctic doesn't care about rank or nationality. It only rewards those who listen to its rhythms. But here's the twist: no physical evidence of this survivor has ever been found. No diary, no identifiable artifact, no definitive proof. That's why his story lingers in the realm of speculation, a ghost at the edges of history. Was he real, or a fabrication born from the human need to soften tragedy with hope? The truth may never be known, yet the very possibility speaks volumes about survival's unpredictable nature. In a place where the environment kills as swiftly as any weapon, endurance isn't just about strength, it's about humility. The Inuit thrived in the Arctic for millennia, not by conquering it, but by understanding it. If one Franklin survivor truly existed, his salvation wouldn't have come from British naval training, but from the willingness to learn from those who called the ice home. The Franklin expedition's legacy is often one of hubris, a cautionary tale about underestimating nature. But the lone survivor's rumored existence offers a counterpoint, a flicker of resilience in the face of catastrophe. Whether fact or folklore, his story forces us to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that survival sometimes means letting go of who you were to become who you must be. And in the vast, indifferent Arctic, that lesson is as vital today as it was 2 centuries ago. The flames that consumed Troy should have erased its people from history, but from the ashes rose one of antiquity's greatest survival stories. As Greek warriors flooded the city, slaughtering and looting, a small group of Trojans did the unthinkable. They slipped through the chaos undetected. Led by the noble Aeneas, a minor prince mentioned in Homer's Iliad, these refugees carried more than just their belongings. They bore the fragile hope of a civilization's rebirth. What followed wasn't just an escape, it was an odyssey that would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean. Aeneas's journey reads like a catalogue of near-impossible trials. Ancient texts describe how he fled with his elderly father Anchises on his back, his young son Ascanius by his side, and a handful of loyal followers. While most survivors would have sought immediate refuge in nearby lands, Aeneas's group faced betrayal, storms, and even the wrath of the gods. Shipwrecked on the coast of North Africa, they encountered Queen Dido of Carthage, whose tragic love for Aeneas nearly derailed their mission. But here's where their survival instinct shines brightest. They pressed on, driven by a prophecy that their descendants would build an empire greater than Troy itself. Their greatest weapon wasn't swords or shields, but adaptability. When the Harpies' mythical winged monsters cursed them with hunger, they learned to scavenge and ration. When war erupted in Italy, they forged alliances with local tribes, trading martial skill for sanctuary. Virgil's Aeneid immortalizes these struggles, but beneath the epic poetry lies a raw truth. These were people who refused to vanish. Every setback became a lesson, every enemy a potential ally. By the time they reached the banks of the Tiber River, they'd transformed from desperate fugitives into founders of a new identity. The legacy of Aeneas's band echoes far beyond myth. Roman emperors traced their lineage to him, weaving Trojan resilience into the fabric of their empire's identity. Archaeological evidence even suggests real migrations from the Bronze Age Aegean to Italy, hinting at a kernel of truth behind the legend. Whether historical or symbolic, their story captures survival's deepest paradox. Sometimes, to endure, you must become something new. Troy fell, but its spirit walked out of the fire in the hearts of those who carried it forward. And in that transformation, they achieved what no wall or army could: immortality. Themistocles should have been a dead man walking. After saving Athens from Persian invasion at the Battle of Salamis, the architect of Greece's greatest naval victory found himself exiled by the very people he'd protected, victim of the fickle politics of ancient Athens. Branded a traitor by his rivals, he fled across the Aegean with bounty hunters on his trail, seeking refuge in the unlikeliest of places, the court of Persia, Athens' mortal enemy. This wasn't just exile, it was a suicide mission. The Persians had every reason to execute him on sight. Yet what followed wasn't just survival. It was one of history's most audacious comebacks, a masterclass in turning desperation into dominance. Arriving in Persia, Themistocles didn't grovel or hide. He walked straight into the lion's den and announced himself to King Artaxerxes with a breathtaking bluff. Claiming he'd been secretly aiding Persian interests for years, he offered to serve as an advisor against Greece. It was a staggering gamble. One wrong move, and he'd be impaled as a spy. But Themistocles understood something his enemies never did. Survival isn't about strength alone. It's about perception. For a full year, he immersed himself in Persian language and customs, studying their weaknesses like a general preparing for battle. When he finally secured an audience with the king, he didn't beg for mercy. He negotiated from a position of calculated power. The real stroke of genius came next. Artaxerxes, wary but intrigued, granted Themistocles control over several Greek cities in Asia Minor. To the Persians, this seemed like a clever way to use the exiled general as a puppet. But Themistocles saw further. He ruled these cities with surprising fairness, building loyalty among the local Greeks while secretly funneling information back to Athens. When whispers reached Persia that he might be playing both sides, he didn't panic. He doubled down. Feigning illness, he staged a dramatic public suicide by drinking bull's blood, a substance ancient Greeks believed was poisonous. The Persians mourned their useful pawn while Themistocles slipped away, his death so convincingly staged that historians debated it for centuries. His final act was pure political theater. Reappearing in Greece years later, he leveraged his Persian connections to broker peace deals, positioning himself as the indispensable man between two empires. The same Athenians who'd exiled him now welcomed his counsel, their hatred softened by time and his undeniable usefulness. Themistocles didn't just survive betrayal, he weaponized it, turning exile into a strategic advantage. His story proves that sometimes the greatest escape isn't physical. It's the ability to rewrite your own narrative, to make even your enemies see you as too valuable to destroy. In a world where power shifted like desert sands, Themistocles became the one constant not by resisting change, but by mastering it. Zenobia, the warrior queen of Palmyra, was supposed to be Rome's ultimate trophy. In the year 272, after leading a rebellion that shook the empire to its core, she was dragged before Emperor Aurelian in golden chains, or so the official story goes. But whispers persist that Rome's greatest humiliation never actually happened, that the defiant queen who dared to challenge an empire might have slipped through history's grasp, vanishing into legend rather than bowing to defeat. Her rise alone was improbable. A widow thrust onto Palmyra's throne, Zenobia transformed her desert kingdom into a regional superpower, conquering Egypt and defying Roman authority with a brilliance that stunned even her enemies. She spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy, and rode into battle alongside her troops, a ruler who embodied both intellect and ferocity. When Aurelian's legions finally besieged Palmyra, she didn't cower behind the walls. Historical accounts describe her rallying defenses in person, directing archers and engineers with the precision of a seasoned general. Even as supplies dwindled and hope faded, she refused surrender until betrayal from within forced her hand. Here's where the mystery deepens. Roman chroniclers insist Zenobia was paraded through the streets during Aurelian's triumph, a broken symbol of rebellion. Yet other sources suggest something far more intriguing. One account claims she was granted a luxurious villa in Tibur, living out her days in quiet exile. Another insists she starved herself on the journey to Rome, choosing death over disgrace, but the most tantalizing theory, that she never reached Rome at all. Some historians point to gaps in the record, noting that no contemporary eyewitnesses definitively place her in the capital. Could she have bribed guards, staged an escape, or even been secretly freed by Aurelian himself, who admired her despite their rivalry? The desert, after all, was Zenobia's ally. Palmyra's vast sands had hidden rebel caravans for centuries. If anyone could disappear into its expanse, it was the queen who knew its secrets. Later legends fueled the speculation. Stories of a noblewoman appearing in Syria years later, her identity carefully guarded, or whispers of a hidden lineage passing down her name through generations. Whether myth or reality, these tales speak to something undeniable. Zenobia's defiance was too potent to be contained by chains. What makes her survival so compelling isn't just the possibility of escape, but the symbolism. In an era when conquered rulers were expected to vanish, Zenobia's legend refused to die. She became a folk hero across the Middle East, a symbol of resistance against oppression. Even today, her name echoes in poetry and revolt, proof that some figures are too larger than life for history to cage. Whether she walked Rome's streets or melted into the desert wind, Zenobia's true victory wasn't in outliving her captors, but in ensuring her story would outlast the empire that sought to erase her. The wreck of the Batavia should have been the end instead. It became the start of a nightmare. In 1629, this Dutch East India Company ship struck a reef off the coast of Western Australia, stranding nearly 300 souls on a speck of land barely larger than a modern city block. What followed wasn't just a struggle against nature, but a descent into madness. As survivors scrambled onto the barren Houtman Abrolhos Islands, a charismatic psychopath named Geronimus Cornelis seized control, turning the disaster into his own twisted empire. Under his command, mutineers systematically slaughtered over 120 men, women, and children until one small band of desperate souls dared the impossible. Led by a junior officer named Weeb Hayes, a group of soldiers and sailors escaped the killing grounds by fleeing to a neighboring island. With nothing but makeshift weapons and sheer determination, they held off wave after wave of attacks, turning their tiny refuge into a fortress. But survival wasn't just about defense, it was about audacity. Realizing rescue might never come, Hayes and his men did something astonishing. They cobbled together a raft from wreckage and set sail across open ocean, navigating treacherous currents with nothing but the stars and sheer instinct to guide them. Imagine the stakes. These weren't seasoned explorers, they were ordinary sailors, many barely out of their teens, facing waters so hostile even modern ships approached them with caution. No charts, no compass, just the crushing certainty that staying meant certain death. Their journey covered over 150 miles of shark-infested sea, a harrowing gauntlet where one wrong turn would mean vanishing without a trace. Yet somehow they made it. When they finally reached the mainland, their ragged appearance and frantic warnings prompted a rescue mission that arrived just in time to stop Cornelis's final massacre. What sets this story apart isn't just the brutality they escaped, it's the ingenuity that saved them. Hayes's group used every scrap of knowledge at their disposal. They read tides like pages in a book, turned driftwood into tools, and transformed desperation into precision. Their survival wasn't luck, it was a masterclass in adaptive thinking. Even more remarkable, the mutineers they left behind had superior numbers and weapons, yet crumbled under their own savagery. Hayes's band proved a timeless truth. In the fight for survival, cohesion outlasts cruelty every time. The Batavia's legacy is a paradox, a story of humanity at its worst and its most resilient. The wreckage still lies beneath those turquoise waters, a ghostly reminder of how thin the line between order and chaos can be. But the real monument isn't the ship. It's the unbroken will of those who refused to let the darkness claim them, who stared into the abyss and rode straight for the horizon. The island of Thera didn't just erupt, it exploded with a force that rewrote history. Around 1600 BCE, one of the most catastrophic volcanic events in recorded history tore through the heart of the Mediterranean, obliterating the thriving Minoan settlement on what we now call Santorini. Tsunamis, ash clouds, and pyroclastic flows swallowed entire cities, leaving behind only whispers of a civilization that once rivaled ancient Egypt. Yet amid the devastation, a fragile thread of survival emerged. Archaeological evidence and scattered fragments of myth suggest that some of Thera's children were sent away before the eruption, dispersed across Crete and beyond like seeds carried by the wind. This wasn't just luck, it was an act of foresight that may have saved Minoan culture from complete annihilation. Buried beneath layers of ash and time, clues point to a society that understood its own vulnerability. Frescoes on surviving Minoan walls depict ships laden with young passengers, their faces turned toward distant shores. Pottery fragments found in Crete bear Thera's distinct artistic motifs, suggesting not just trade but transplantation. Even more telling are the genetic studies linking later populations in the Aegean to Thera's bloodlines, as if the island's DNA outlasted its geography. But how did these children escape? Some scholars believe the Minoans, attuned to the Earth's tremors, recognized the warning signs: ground shaking, sulfurous smells, strange animal behavior, and acted swiftly. Others argue the Exodus was part of a long-standing tradition, a way to strengthen alliances through fostering. Either way, the result was the same. Pockets of Thera's culture took root elsewhere, preserving knowledge, art, and language that might otherwise have been lost. Consider what this survival meant for the ancient world. These children weren't just refugees, they were living libraries. they carried with them the secrets of minnow navigation, medicine, and architecture skills that would later influence Greek and Phoenician civilizations. One particularly striking example comes from the island of Anafi, where archaeologists uncovered a settlement with Thera-style buildings erected just decades after the eruption. The design was unmistakable: curved walls, vibrant frescoes, and advanced drainage systems, all hallmarks of a culture thought to have been erased. It's as if the survivors rebuilt their homeland from memory, stone by stone. The real lesson here isn't just about escape, it's about legacy. The Theran children's dispersal mirrors a strategy modern disaster planners call redundancy, spreading critical resources to ensure continuity. The Minoans, intentionally or not, practiced a form of cultural backup, ensuring that even if one node of their civilization collapsed, others could regenerate. Their story forces us to rethink ancient societies as dynamic, adaptive networks rather than static monuments. When Thera fell, its people didn't just vanish. They transformed, seeding the future with fragments of their past. And in that quiet act of preservation, they achieved something even the volcano couldn't destroy: immortality. In the shadows of Mount Unzen, where jagged cliffs meet the sea, the Shimabara Rebellion's final act unfolded not on a battlefield, but in the suffocating darkness of hidden caves. It was 1638 when 40,000 peasants and Ronin, led by the teenage martyr Amakusa Shiro, made their last stand against the shogunate's overwhelming force. When Hara Castle fell after months of siege, the surviving rebels faced a grim choice: surrender and renounce their forbidden Christian faith, or vanish into the labyrinth of volcanic tunnels beneath the peninsula. A handful chose the caves not just to hide, but to preserve something the shogun's armies couldn't destroy. For years, these fugitives lived like ghosts. They navigated by touch through pitch-black passages, drinking condensation from stone and eating lichen scraped off walls. But their most ingenious survival tool wasn't physical, it was their secret worship. Using coded knocks to communicate and makeshift altars carved into rock, they maintained a faith that could have gotten them crucified if discovered. Some accounts suggest they even developed an entire underground liturgical calendar, marking feast days with silent prayers and hidden symbols. When hunger gnawed at them, it was their conviction that sustained them, the belief that their suffering mirrored Christ's own trials. What's truly remarkable is how they adapted their religion to their new reality. Jesuit missionaries had originally brought Catholicism to Japan decades earlier, but these cave Christians transformed it into something uniquely their own. Without priests or sacraments, they distilled their faith to its essence. Communal meals became Eucharistic acts, whispered psalms replaced hymns, and the very act of breathing in that damp darkness became a form of prayer. Archaeological evidence shows they repurposed Buddhist statues as covert Christian icons, chiseling crosses into their bases, a brilliant act of cultural camouflage. The shogunate assumed they'd starve within months, yet when hunters finally stumbled upon them years later, the survivors weren't skeletal wraiths, but organized communities with children who'd never seen sunlight. Their resilience exposed the limits of Tokugawa power. You could outlaw a religion, but you couldn't kill what people carried in their hearts. Some historians argue these hidden Christians, or Kakyo Karishitan, became Japan's most enduring resistance movement, preserving their faith in secret for over 250 years until religious freedom returned in the 19th century. Their story forces us to redefine survival. These weren't warriors clinging to life, but guardians of an idea. Every day underground was an act of defiance against an empire that had erased their churches and martyred their leaders. When they finally emerged, whether by choice or capture, they carried something unstoppable, proof that faith could outlast even the longest siege. In the end, the Shimabara caves didn't just shelter bodies. They incubated a legacy that no sword could sever. The Sahara has swallowed countless souls, but none as spectacularly as the 50,000 warriors of Cambyses II. In 524 BCE, Persia's mighty army marched toward the Siwa oasis, intent on crushing the oracle of Ammon for its defiance. Then, without warning, the desert struck back. A sandstorm of biblical proportions roared to life, swallowing men, horses, and weapons whole. Ancient historians like Herodotus wrote of their disappearance as divine punishment, a force of nature erasing an entire army in hours. But whispers persist that not all were lost. Local Berber tribes still tell stories of pale-skinned strangers emerging from the dunes generations later, their descendants bearing fragments of Persian armor and odd, unfamiliar rituals. What makes this mystery so compelling isn't just the scale of the loss, but the tantalizing possibility of adaptation. Imagine the survivors, disoriented, stripped of supplies, with no hope of returning home. The desert offers no quarter to the unprepared, yet these soldiers may have done the unthinkable. They went native. Nomadic Tuareg traders speak of ancestors who traded with fair-skinned warriors, men who fought with curved blades unlike anything seen in the Sahara before. Some scholars point to archaeological oddities, like Persian-style daggers found far from trade routes, or the sudden appearance of advanced well-digging techniques in remote oases. Could these be traces of the lost army's knowledge passed down through alliances or coercion? The logistics of their survival boggle the mind. 50,000 is no small band, it's a city on the move. Without supply lines, they'd have had to split into smaller groups, scattering like seeds in the wind. Some may have joined existing tribes, trading military skill for food and shelter. Others might have turned to raiding, their discipline giving them an edge over local factions. The most striking theory comes from linguists who have noted peculiar loanwords in some Berber dialects, terms for weapons and governance that bear eerie similarities to Old Persian. Language, after all, is the last fortress of the displaced, yet the Sahara guards its secrets fiercely. No mass grave, no abandoned camp has ever been definitively linked to Cambyses' army. Modern expeditions using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have turned up empty. This absence feeds the legend, transforming historical tragedy into something more fluid, a tale of cultural metamorphosis. Perhaps the real story isn't about an army vanishing, but about men who refused to die, who traded their identity as conquerors for the harder, quieter victory of endurance. In the end, the desert doesn't care if you're a king's soldier or a beggar. It only asks one question: can you adapt? The Phantom Army's legacy, real or imagined, suggests that some of them answered yes. The legend of Spartacus's rebellion doesn't end with 6,000 crosses lining the Appian Way. Hidden in the rugged peaks of southern Italy, a handful of gladiators may have slipped through Rome's grasp, trading certain death for a fleeting taste of freedom. These weren't just escaped slaves, they were men who'd stared down legions and nearly won, their survival a final act of defiance against an empire built on their backs. After the revolt's collapse in 71 BCE, Rome made sure the world saw its vengeance. Crassus's troops crucified survivors along the road to Capua, a grisly warning to any who dared challenge the system. Yet ancient chroniclers like Plutarch hint at gaps in the body count. Some rebels, they suggest, vanished into the Apennines, using their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver pursuers. For warriors trained in the arena, the mountains offered a cruel irony, another brutal landscape, but this time on their own terms. Life on the run would have demanded a different kind of endurance. No cheering crowds, no scheduled battles, just the silent struggle to outlast winter storms and Roman patrols. Local shepherds might have traded food for protection, their allegiances swayed by sympathy or fear. Archaeologists have found caves in the region with traces of makeshift forges, suggesting someone was repairing weapons long after the revolt ended. Were these the hideouts of desperate men, or proof of a network that lasted years? The real mystery isn't just whether they survived, but how long their freedom held. Rome never stopped hunting threats to its order, yet folklore from Calabria to Lucania tells of ghost gladiators, shadowy figures who ambushed tax collectors or sheltered runaway slaves. One particularly haunting tale describes a lone fighter found decades later, his hair white, his body scarred, still clutching a broken sword engraved with the word Spartak. Whether fact or fiction, these stories reveal a truth beyond historical record. Spartacus's rebellion didn't truly end. It scattered into the hills, becoming a whisper of resistance that no cross could silence. Their legacy isn't measured in years lived, but in the fear they inspired. Every runaway who evaded capture chipped away at Rome's myth of invincibility. Even today, their defiance resonates not as a footnote to defeat, but as proof that freedom's flame burns brightest in those who refuse to be extinguished. The Arctic winter of 1871 was not meant for human survival. When 33 whaling ships became trapped in the merciless grip of pack ice near Point Belcher, Alaska, over 1,200 sailors made the desperate decision to abandon their vessels, embarking on a brutal march across the frozen wilderness. But amid the exodus, a handful of men did the unthinkable. They stayed behind. While the rest of the fleet vanished into the white expanse, these few became prisoners of their own ships, locked in a battle against cold, starvation, and the crushing weight of solitude. Their story isn't just about endurance, it's a masterclass in transforming a death trap into a lifeline. Left aboard the Eliza and a handful of other icebound vessels, the men faced conditions that would break most. Temperatures plunged to 60 degrees below zero, with darkness stretching 20 hours a day. Yet they turned their frozen prisons into fortresses. Whale oil became their salvation, burned in makeshift lamps for warmth, used to seal cracks in the hull against the wind, even repurposed to waterproof their ragged clothing. But their true innovation lay beneath their feet. The ship's holds, once packed with barrels of provisions, were picked clean by the departing crews. What remained wasn't food, but knowledge. These whalers had spent years in the Arctic, and they understood its cruel rhythms. They scavenged the ice for seals, using harpoons to fish through cracks in the frozen sea. When fuel ran low, they tore apart empty barrels and non-essential wood, burning it sparingly in a stove they kept alive like a sacred flame. The psychological toll was as brutal as the cold. With no hope of rescue until spring, 6 months away, the men structured their days with military precision. They took turns on watch for polar bears, held daily readings from the ship's Bible, and meticulously rationed their dwindling supplies. Diaries recovered later reveal a haunting reality. They marked time not by calendars, but by the slow creep of frost across the cabin walls. Yet in that isolation, they found a grim camaraderie. One account describes how they played chess with carved ivory pieces, the games stretching for weeks, each move debated like a council of war. This wasn't just distraction, it was a lifeline to sanity, a way to assert control over a world that had none. What truly defies belief is how they outlasted even the rescue parties. The sailors who'd fled overland, most perished in the attempt, but the men who stayed, who trusted the very ships that had betrayed them, emerged alive when the ice finally loosened its grip. Their survival wasn't luck, it was the result of a counterintuitive truth. Sometimes the safest place in a disaster is the eye of the storm. They'd traded the illusion of escape for the hard reality of adaptation, and in doing so, proved that survival isn't just about movement. It's about knowing when to stand still. The waters came without warning. One moment, Helike stood proud as one of ancient Greece's most powerful cities, a thriving hub of trade and worship nestled along the Gulf of Corinth. The next, the earth itself split open in the dead of night, swallowing homes, temples, and streets whole as tsunami waves finished what the quake began. By dawn, Helike had vanished beneath the sea, its very existence erased, or so it seemed. But history rarely writes endings so neatly. Amid the chaos, a handful of Helike's people did the impossible. They outran the disaster, clawing their way to higher ground as their world collapsed behind them. Their escape wasn't just luck, it was the beginning of one of antiquity's most overlooked survival stories. These survivors faced more than just trauma. They carried the weight of a civilization on their shoulders. Ancient sources like Strabo describe how the displaced Helikians refused to scatter to the winds. Instead, they regrouped in the hills, salvaging what they could from the wreckage, not just tools or treasures, but something far more vital, their identity. Within months, they began rebuilding a short distance inland, constructing a new settlement that echoed the old city's layout. Archaeologists have found eerie parallels between the sunken ruins and the later town, from the alignment of streets to the placement of altars. This wasn't just practicality, it was an act of defiance, a way to tell the gods and the earth itself, "You took our home, but not our memory of it." What's truly remarkable is how they turned catastrophe into cultural power. The survivors didn't hide their trauma, they weaponized it. Their new city became a pilgrimage site where visitors came to hear first-hand accounts of the disaster, an ancient version of disaster tourism. The Helikians even minted coins depicting their patron god Poseidon, subduing the very waves that had destroyed them, a brilliant piece of propaganda that transformed victimhood into divine favor. Local legends grew around their escape, claiming the city's founders had received a cryptic warning from a colony of rats fleeing inland days before the quake. Whether true or not, the story reveals a key survival tactic, the ability to reframe chaos as destiny. The deeper you dig, the more ingenious their adaptation becomes. Recent excavations suggest they didn't just rebuild, they innovated. The new Helike featured elevated foundations and earthquake-resistant masonry, techniques later adopted across Greece. Their traders leveraged their notoriety, spinning tales of surviving the wrath of Poseidon to secure better deals in distant ports. Even their religion evolved. Inscriptions show they added new festivals honoring both the disaster and their rebirth, weaving resilience into their spiritual DNA. Helike's legacy isn't just a sunken city. It's the blueprint these survivors left for turning total loss into lasting influence. Their story forces us to rethink what survival really means. It's not merely enduring, it's rewriting the narrative so thoroughly that even your greatest defeat becomes part of your strength. 2,400 years later, their message echoes. Civilizations aren't measured by their catastrophes, but by what they build from the wreckage. The royal decree struck like a thunderclap in 1492. All Jews in Spain must convert or leave. Thousands fled, but others made a choice that would test the limits of faith and survival. They stayed, outwardly embracing Christianity while clinging to Judaism in secret. These conversos, or new Christians, became masters of deception, weaving an entire parallel existence beneath the nose of the Inquisition. Their story isn't just about hiding, it's about the extraordinary lengths people will go to preserve who they are, even when the world demands they vanish. Imagine the daily tightrope they walked. A converso family might attend Mass by morning, then rush home to light Sabbath candles in a hidden basement. They baked unleavened bread for Passover behind locked shutters, using olive oil instead of pork fat to avoid suspicion. Some even crafted hollowed-out books with Torah passages concealed inside, their spines disguised as volumes of Christian hymns. The most ingenious trick, encoding Jewish rituals into seemingly innocuous traditions. A family recipe for Saturday stew might actually be a way to keep the prohibition against cooking on the Sabbath, leaving the pot to simmer overnight before Sunday's meal. Every gesture, every mumbled prayer became a silent rebellion. But survival demanded more than secrecy, it demanded reinvention. Inquisition records reveal how conversos developed entire networks of trust. A dropped phrase, a half-finished prayer, or the way someone sliced an apple could signal shared faith without a word. In Toledo, archaeologists uncovered homes with tiny peepholes near doorframes, likely used to check for spies before whispering prayers. Others found refuge in Spain's mountains, where remote villages like Hervás became safe havens. There, they preserved Ladino, a Judeo-Spanish language, lullabies their children sang carrying echoes of psalms. The real miracle wasn't just their endurance, but their adaptability. When the Inquisition banned circumcision, some conversos performed symbolic rituals with wine instead of blood. Without synagogues, they turned dinner tables into altars, blessing wine as medicinal tonic to avoid suspicion. Even their art became a canvas for defiance, paintings of Old Testament scenes hung in plain sight, their symbolism lost on Christian neighbors but screaming with meaning to those who knew. Centuries later, the legacy of these secret Jews still pulses through Spain. In the 1920s, a traveler in Portugal stumbled upon a village where families lit Friday night lamps and avoided pork, customs preserved for generations, long after the original reason was forgotten. Modern DNA tests reveal unexpected Jewish ancestry in Latin America, where conversos carried their hidden faith across oceans. Their survival wasn't just about stubbornness, it was about the quiet, relentless power of cultural memory. They proved that even when a people are erased from records, they endure in the unbroken chain of whispered prayers, in the recipes that outlast empires, in the stubborn refusal to let the past die. And in that refusal, they achieved what the Inquisition never could: immortality. The last Viking in Greenland wasn't supposed to survive. By the mid-15th century, the Norse settlements that had thrived for centuries were crumbling. Abandoned farms littered the fjords, church bells silenced by the cold. Yet when archaeologists excavated a remote fjord centuries later, they found something astonishing: the remains of a single Norse man who'd outlived his people by years, maybe decades. His bones told a story science is still unraveling. This wasn't just endurance, it was a radical act of reinvention. A man who looked extinction in the face and refused to blink. Isolation would have been his constant companion. With no ships arriving from Norway, no neighbors to barter with, every day became a calculation against starvation. But here's where the mystery deepens. Unlike his countrymen who clung to European ways, trying to farm failing fields or hunt dwindling game, this lone survivor left clues of something extraordinary. His tools show signs of repair with walrus ivory and whalebone, materials the Norse rarely used but the Inuit mastered. Charred seal bones in his hearth suggest he adopted the hunting techniques of the very people his ancestors had dismissed as scralings. Somehow, he'd done the unthinkable, crossed a cultural line his community never could. Why stay when everyone else fled? The answer might lie in a single artifact: a rusted iron knife found near his dwelling, its handle wrapped in sealskin. Iron meant connection to his Norse identity. The sealskin spoke of adaptation. Perhaps he was too old to risk the voyage back across the treacherous North Atlantic. Maybe he'd lost too much family, faith, the world he knew to care about returning. Or just possibly, he'd glimpsed a truth his fellows missed: that survival in Greenland demanded shedding old prejudices like a winter coat. The Inuit had thrived there for millennia, not by resisting the land, but by listening to it. His final years would have been a study in solitude. Imagine the silence, no clang of smithies, no psalm chanting from wooden churches, just the wind howling through empty longhouses. Yet evidence suggests he didn't just endure, he curated memories. Among his belongings were a broken crucifix and a carved chess piece, fragile links to a vanishing world. Did he replay games in his mind, clinging to fragments of the life he'd lost? Or had he made peace with being the last, a bridge between two cultures that would only meet again centuries later? The real enigma isn't how he survived, but why he chose to. In the end, his story overturns everything we assume about collapse. Civilizations fall, but people don't vanish, they change. His grave holds no saga, no epic poem, just bones, a few tools, and the quiet triumph of a man who rewrote his destiny with every seal he hunted, every fire he lit against the Arctic dark. He proves that sometimes the most radical act of preservation isn't holding on, it's knowing what to let go. High in the Tian Shan Mountains, where the wind howls like a grieving spirit, a burial site from 1,000 years ago tells a story colder than the ice that preserves it. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Silk Road caravan, 11 souls frozen in time, their postures twisted in final moments of agony, but one grave stands apart. This man didn't die in the storm. His body lies carefully arranged, wrapped in borrowed cloaks, surrounded by the very travelers he buried with his own hands. His survival, even briefly, speaks of a determination so fierce it defies the elements. The clues etched into the ice paint a haunting picture, while the others were found scattered, caught mid-flight from some sudden terror. Perhaps an avalanche or a blizzard that blinded them. This lone survivor had time. Time to gather his comrades, to dig shallow graves in unforgiving ground, to perform rites no one would witness. His tools tell part of the tale, a rusted knife with a snapped tip, likely used to chip at frozen earth until his hands gave out. But it's his physical state that chills the most. Frostbite had blackened his fingers, and his ribs showed signs of old fractures, long healed. This wasn't his first brush with death, just his last. What kept him going when logic screamed to surrender? Perhaps obligation, a merchant guarding precious silks or spices, unwilling to let his cargo vanish into the snow. Or loyalty, driven by the unspoken code of caravan masters who placed their people above all else. But the most compelling theory lies in his possessions. Among the recovered artifacts was a small wooden figurine, its features worn smooth by touch, a child's toy. Had he been racing home, the route they took, a treacherous shortcut through high passes, suggests urgency. Maybe he wasn't just surviving for himself, but for someone waiting beyond the mountains. The cruelest twist, he nearly made it. Scraps of a map found nearby indicate the next way station was less than a day's walk when the storm hit. So close to warmth, to safety, yet impossibly far. His final act, burying those who fell beside him, wasn't just practicality. It was defiance. In stacking those stones over his companions, he left a message carved not in wood or bone, but in the land itself. We were here. The mountains took their bodies, but not their memory. Silk Road lore is filled with tales of vanished travelers, their fates swallowed by sand or snow. But this grave is different. It doesn't whisper of loss, it shouts of resilience. That figurine, those fractured ribs, the painstaking burials, they force us to reckon with a truth as old as humanity itself. Survival isn't always about living. Sometimes it's about choosing how you meet the end and who you refuse to leave behind. The island was a cruel joke, a speck of volcanic rock adrift in the South Atlantic, where fresh water was scarcer than hope. When the Dutch ship abandoned Leendert Hasenbosch in 1725, he wasn't just marooned. He was sentenced to a slow death. Ascension Island offered no lush forests, no babbling streams, just sun-baked lava fields and the relentless scream of seabirds. Yet against all odds, this castaway didn't perish in weeks as expected. He clung to life for months, transforming hell into home through sheer, desperate creativity. Heisenbosch's first challenge was hydration. With no natural springs, he devised a system straight out of a survival manual that didn't exist yet. Using salvaged ship's canvas, he stretched cloth between rocks to catch the morning dew, funneling droplets into turtle shells. When rain came rare and fleeting, he channeled runoff into hollowed-out volcanic crevices, creating makeshift cisterns, but his most startling adaptation. Drinking turtle blood, green sea turtles clambered ashore to nest, and Heisenbosch learned to flip them onto their backs, puncturing a vein in their necks to collect the salty but life-sustaining fluid. It was a brutal solution, but the alternative was death by thirst. Food demanded equal ingenuity. Ascension's barren soil grew little beyond scraggly shrubs, but Heisenbosch turned the island's wildlife into a gruesome pantry. He scavenged eggs from seabird nests, ate raw tern meat, and even cracked open the shells of land crabs, though their bitter flesh often made him sick. His journal, later found by passing sailors, described boiling seaweed with bits of turtle fat to make a wretched but calorie-rich broth. What's truly remarkable isn't just what he ate, but what he refused. Despite starvation, he avoided the island's endemic cabbage plants, likely recognizing their toxicity. This wasn't blind desperation, it was calculated survival. Shelter became his masterpiece. Using driftwood and the bones of dead turtles, he built a low hut near the island's highest point, where sea breeze offered respite from the equatorial heat. He lined the floor with dry grass for insulation and arranged black volcanic stones in a circle outside to absorb sunlight, radiating warmth during chilly nights. But his psychological tactics were even more impressive. To stave off madness, he marked days by carving notches into a piece of mastwood, held imaginary conversations with seabirds, and even farmed by transplanting edible lichens near his hut, a futile effort, but one that gave him purpose. The cruelest twist, rescue was achingly close. Ships occasionally passed within sight of Ascension, but none spotted his signal fires. Heisenbosch's fate remains uncertain. Some say he died waiting, others claim he fashioned a raft and vanished into the Atlantic. But his legacy isn't tragedy. It's the blueprint he left for all castaways. Survival isn't about the land's generosity, but the human mind's limitless ability to reshape reality. On an island that offered nothing, he created just enough to endure, and in that struggle, he proved even the harshest prison can't cage ingenuity. For 2.5 centuries, the faith survived in whispers. When Japan banned Christianity in 1614, shogunate officials assumed the foreign religion would wither like an uprooted weed. But deep in the fishing villages of Kyushu and the misty valleys of Nagasaki, something extraordinary took root, an underground faith so resilient it outlasted samurai, shoguns, and even the memory of the European priests who first planted it. These hidden Christians, or Kakyor Karishiten, didn't just preserve their beliefs, they reinvented them, stitching together Catholic doctrine with Buddhist imagery and Shinto rituals until their worship became something entirely new, yet unmistakably ancient. The first survival tactic was camouflage. Without churches or clergy, the faithful turned everyday objects into sacred vessels. A statue of the Virgin Mary might be disguised as Canon, the Buddhist goddess of mercy, her infant Jesus subtly reshaped to resemble a bodhisattva. Crosses were carved into the undersides of floorboards or woven into fishing nets as good luck knots. Even the act of prayer transformed. Reciting Latin verses became dangerous, so believers developed oratio, a phonetic blend of Portuguese prayers and Japanese that sounded like nonsense to eavesdropping officials. One particularly ingenious trick involved using a gozai, a Buddhist prayer bead necklace, to secretly count Hail Marys by moving beads under their sleeves. But survival demanded more than deception. It required reinvention. Cut off from Rome for generations, the Caryatian developed their own theology. Baptismal rites used seawater instead of holy water. Communion wafers were replaced with rice cakes. The most startling adaptation was their veneration of ancestors. Forbidden from openly mourning Christian martyrs, they folded them into the Buddhist tradition of Senzokuyo, honoring the dead with offerings at household altars. To outsiders, it looked like typical Japanese ancestor worship, but the prayers whispered over those altars told a different story. The real miracle wasn't just their endurance, but their secrecy. In the village of Sotome, families developed a coded language of gestures. Touching one's earlobe during a conversation could signal shared faith, while refusing a cup of tea poured from the left side, an allusion to Christ's pierced side, might confirm it. Children learned catechism through lullabies with veiled lyrics, their innocence protecting the community. When French missionaries finally returned in 1865, they were stunned to find entire villages where people still crossed themselves, not with the Latin formula, but with phrases like Tenjiku no Kami, God of the heavenly realm, a term unrecognizable to Western priests but dripping with 2 centuries of adaptation. What makes their survival so profound isn't just the length of time, it's the psychological toll. Imagine living your entire life knowing one slip could mean torture for your family. The Fiumi, bronze plaques of Christ or Mary that officials forced suspects to trample, became a recurring nightmare. Some believers carved tiny Fiumi of their own to practice stepping on at home, hardening their hearts for the public test. Others carried fragments of burned martyr bones as talismans, physical reminders of the cost of faith. This wasn't passive resistance, it was an act of collective memory so potent it turned kitchen shrines into cathedrals and bedtime stories into scripture. When religious freedom finally came in 1873, the outside world expected the hidden Christians to rush back to pure Catholicism. Instead, many resisted. Their faith had grown roots too deep to transplant. Today, descendants still gather in homes around Nagasaki, singing Orasho with accents no European would recognize, their Bibles filled with notes in a cipher only they can read. Their greatest triumph wasn't outlasting persecution. It was proving that faith isn't bound by walls or words. Sometimes, the most powerful form of survival is the kind that leaves no trace, burning quietly in the dark until the world is ready to see its light. Deep in the limestone caves of Gibraltar, the last embers of an entire species flickered against the gathering dark. While most Neanderthals vanished from Europe around 40,000 years ago, a tiny band clung to existence in this southernmost tip of the continent, surviving in isolation for thousands of years after their kin had disappeared. Their story isn't just about extinction, it's a mystery of endurance, a puzzle that forces us to rethink what it means to be the last of your kind. What set these final holdouts apart? The answer might lie in the very rock that sheltered them. Gorham's Cave, where archaeologists uncovered their tools and hearths, offered something rare in the ancient world, a natural fortress with access to both land and sea. While other Neanderthal groups struggled with shifting climates and dwindling prey, these survivors leveraged their coastal position to exploit a diverse menu. Mussels pried from tidal rocks, monk seals ambushed along shorelines, even the occasional stranded dolphin. Their diet left traces in the cave's soil, layers of shell fragments and fish bones revealing an adaptability earlier Neanderthals supposedly lacked. But survival wasn't just about food. The cave's thermal properties created a microclimate cool in summer, insulated in winter, while its high vantage point provided clear views of approaching danger. Even more intriguing are the artifacts found there, finely crafted stone blades showing techniques once thought exclusive to Homo sapiens. Some scholars argue these weren't imitations, but independent innovations, proof that necessity didn't just breed adaptation, but ingenuity. A single engraved crosshatch pattern on the cave wall, possibly symbolic, hints at cognitive depths we're only beginning to understand. The real enigma isn't how they lasted, but why they alone endured. Genetic evidence suggests the Gibraltar group avoided the inbreeding that doomed other isolated populations. Some theories propose they benefited from occasional contact with modern humans, trading knowledge without fully assimilating. Others point to their small numbers, perhaps just a few dozen individuals, as paradoxical strength. Like a flame burning brightest when trimmed low, their tiny community may have been more agile, more focused than larger groups burdened by competition. Their final days remain shrouded in silence. No mass grave, no dramatic end, just a gradual thinning of the archaeological record until one day, no fire was lit in the cave's deepest chamber. Yet their legacy lingers in our own DNA, in the 2% of Neanderthal genes carried by most non-African humans today. Those traces whisper a truth science is only now embracing. Extinction isn't always disappearance. Sometimes it's transformation. The last Neanderthals didn't just vanish, they passed their torch quietly, their resilience woven into the fabric of the species that outlived them. And in that quiet passing, they achieved a kind of immortality no cave could contain. Alexander's army marched across the known world like a force of nature, but not everyone wanted to be part of the storm. As the conqueror pushed deeper into Asia, a handful of soldiers made a choice that defied all expectations. They walked away. These deserters didn't just vanish into the wilderness. They carved out new lives in the remote valleys of the Hindu Kush and the Pamir Mountains, trading the glory of empire for the hard-won freedom of self-exile. Their story isn't about cowardice, it's about the courage to reject destiny and rewrite it with your own hands. The first challenge was survival in a land that offered no mercy. These weren't lush river valleys or fertile plains, they were jagged, wind-scoured places where winter came early and stayed late. Yet the deserters adapted with a skill that would have made their old commanders proud. Archaeological finds in northern Afghanistan reveal traces of their presence. Greek-style coins minted with unfamiliar symbols, fragments of pottery blending Hellenic designs with local motifs. They didn't just cling to their past, they fused it with the present, creating something entirely new. Some became mercenaries, hiring out their combat skills to local rulers. Others turned to farming, engineering terraced fields into mountainsides using techniques borrowed from both Macedonia and the steppes. But the real surprise: they thrived. Legends from the region speak of fair-haired warriors who married into local tribes, their descendants marked by lighter features centuries later. The Kalash people of modern-day Pakistan, with their striking blue eyes and ancient festivals honoring Dionysus, may carry whispers of these forgotten soldiers in their bloodlines. Even their language left echoes. Linguists have noted Greek loanwords in remote Himalayan dialects, words for tools and tactics that traveled further than Alexander himself ever did. Yet peace came at a price. Isolation bred suspicion, and scattered accounts tell of clashes with neighboring tribes over land and resources. Without the might of the phalanx behind them, these former soldiers had to negotiate, compromise, and sometimes fight dirty to hold what they'd claimed. One particularly haunting tale describes a group of deserters who fortified a high pass, holding it against all comers until their beards turned white and their spears rusted in their hands. They didn't conquer like Alexander, they endured stubbornly and on their own terms. What makes their story so compelling isn't just the act of leaving, but what they built afterward. These weren't broken men fleeing battle, they were pioneers choosing a different kind of victory. In the end, their greatest rebellion wasn't against their king, but against the very idea that a person's fate is written before they draw breath. The valleys they settled still whisper their names, not as deserters, but as founders' proof that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is lay down his sword and pick up a plow. The mines of Lorien were a death sentence in silver, dark, airless pits where slaves worked until their lungs gave out or their backs broke. But one man, whose name history never recorded, refused to accept that fate. His escape wasn't just a dash for freedom, it was an odyssey that would take him across mountains, through hostile cities, and into the pages of legend. Unlike most runaways who fled toward the nearest port or border, this slave chose a path so audacious it bordered on madness. He walked straight into the heart of Greece, following the very roads his pursuers would least expect him to take. His first advantage was sheer desperation. Roman mine slaves were chained at night and branded on the forehead, a mark impossible to hide. Yet archaeological evidence from the period suggests he may have used the mine's own tools against his captors. A broken shackle found near an ancient tunnel bears file marks, hinting at nights spent quietly weakening the metal. Once free, he likely smeared his brand with dirt or vinegar to mimic a wound, blending in among the itinerant laborers who crisscrossed the empire. But his true genius lay in his route. Instead of heading for the coast where patrols hunted escapees, he traveled inland toward Delphi, posing as a pilgrim. Sanctuary cities like this offered temporary protection, and the constant flow of visitors provided cover. The journey itself reads like a hero's trial. Without maps or guides, he navigated by the stars and the stories of other slaves. Whispers of safe houses and sympathetic farmers passed like contraband. At one point, he may have hidden in plain sight among a traveling theater troupe, their garish costumes masking his scars. Later accounts speak of a runaway who survived a winter in the Pindus Mountains by stealing wool from sheep and weaving it into crude clothing, a trick straight from Odysseus' playbook. Every mile demanded new disguises, a beggar here, a potter's assistant there, always moving before suspicion could take root. What elevates his story beyond mere survival is how it intertwines with myth. The path he took from the mines of Attica to the wilds of Epirus mirrors the mythical journeys of Greek heroes. Like Jason fleeing Colchis or Theseus escaping the labyrinth, his ordeal became a saga of cunning over strength. Local folklore from Thessaly even tells of a ghost slave who outwitted a Roman patrol by leading them into quicksand, a tale that may hold kernels of truth. The most compelling evidence comes from a 1st century inscription in Dodona, where a freedman's gratitude to the gods who guide the lost aligns eerily with the timeline of his escape. In the end, his greatest weapon wasn't speed or stealth, but psychology. Roman authorities expected runaways to act like prey, hiding, trembling, clinging to shadows. By contrast, this man moved with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged, turning their assumptions against them. His story challenges everything we think we know about slavery in antiquity. Freedom wasn't just a destination, it was a performance, and he played his part so well that history itself struggled to tell fact from fiction. That unnamed slave didn't just escape his chains, he slipped into the space between memory and legend, proving that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to disappear. The Black Death didn't just kill, it sculpted. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, It carved a path of devastation so complete that some regions lost half their population in months. Yet amid the carnage, a handful of villages stood untouched, their inhabitants watching as death circled like a wolf outside a firelit window. These weren't just lucky outliers, they were enigmas that still baffle scientists today. How did places like Iam in England or the remote valleys of the Swiss Alps escape the worst pandemic in human history? The answer might rewrite everything we think we know about survival in the face of invisible killers. Take Iam, the so-called plague village that turned self-imposed quarantine into an art form. When the disease arrived in 1665 via a flea-infested bundle of cloth, the villagers made a chilling pact: no one would leave. For 14 months, they lived in deliberate isolation, marking their boundaries with stones and leaving payments for outside merchants in vinegar-filled hollows to disinfect coins. The strategy was brutal but effective. While nearby towns saw infection rates soar past 70%, Iam's death toll plateaued at around 250, sparing nearly half its population. What's astonishing isn't just their discipline, but their understanding of contagion centuries before germ theory. They didn't know about Yersinia pestis, but they grasped the power of barriers. Then there's the mystery of the alpine refuges. High in the mountains, communities like the Walser villages of Switzerland reported almost no plague deaths, despite being surrounded by devastated lowlands. Modern research points to their unique lifestyle as accidental armor. Their homes, built far apart on rocky slopes, offered natural social distancing. Their diet, heavy on fermented goat cheese and wild herbs, may have boosted gut microbiomes that somehow resisted infection. But the real revelation came in 2015, when geneticists discovered some descendants of these communities carry a mutation in the ARAP2 gene, linked to more efficient immune responses. Nature and nurture, it seems, conspired in their favor. Yet immunity alone doesn't explain every outlier. In Milan, health officials under the Visconti family implemented draconian measures, sealing plague houses with the sick inside, burning contaminated belongings, and enforcing strict curfews. Their death toll was a fraction of Florence's or Venice's. Meanwhile, in Poland, historians note that widespread restrictions on travel, combined with a decentralized population, created a buffer against the worst. These weren't miracles, they were early public health experiments, proving that human action could bend the curve of catastrophe. The most tantalizing clue, however, lies beneath the soil. Archaeologists studying mass graves in London found something unexpected: skeletons with plague DNA but no signs of the telltale buboes. These individuals may have had asymptomatic or mild cases, hinting at pre-existing immunity. Fast forward to 2022, when researchers analyzing ancient DNA from plague pits identified immune-related June variants in survivors that are still present in modern Europeans. The Black Death, it seems, didn't just cull populations, it reshaped our very biology, leaving behind descendants with hidden defenses. What unites these survivors isn't just luck, but the interplay of biology, behavior, and sheer human ingenuity. Iam's sacrifice, the Alps' isolation, Milan's bureaucracy, each was a different answer to the same existential question. Their legacies whisper a truth we're still grappling with today: that survival in the face of pandemics is never passive. It's the sum of countless small choices, from the genes we inherit to the walls we build, proving that even in the darkest times, humanity doesn't just endure, it adapts. The storm that shattered Alkias' ship should have drowned more than just his body. It should have erased his voice forever. Yet when the waves spat the Greek poet onto the shores of Lemnos in the 6th century BCE, he carried something unexpected from the wreckage: his own words scrawled on wax tablets bobbing amid the debris. This wasn't just luck, it was a testament to the unlikeliest survival tool of all art itself. While other shipwreck victims clung to driftwood or barrels, Alkias clung to poetry, his verses becoming both buoy and beacon in the chaos. His rescue reads like a metaphor ripped from his own lyrics. Fishermen spotting the floating tablets mistook them for divine signs at first, their surfaces etched with symbols that shimmered like Morse code from the gods. When they pulled the near-drowned poet from the surf, he reportedly gasped not for water, but for a stylus desperate to record the experience before it faded. Later scholars would debate whether the story was literal truth or legend, but the underlying message rings clear. Creativity isn't just a reflection of life, sometimes it's the thing that sustains it. What makes Alkias' tale so compelling isn't just the physical salvation, but the psychological lifeline his art provided. His surviving fragments describe the shipwreck in visceral detail. The white-fanged waves, the sky ripped like parchment, yet they're framed as lyric poetry, not frantic diary entries. This transformation of trauma into structure, chaos into meter, hints at something profound. The act of composing while drowning wasn't just documentation, it was an act of control. Each line was a rope thrown across the abyss, tethering him to reason when the world dissolved into salt and fury. The deeper irony, Alkias was no stranger to catastrophe. A political exile before becoming a castaway, he'd already turned his verse into a weapon, mocking tyrants and mourning lost causes. His poetry had survived banishment, and now it had outlasted Poseidon's wrath. Later in life, he'd write that "song is the oar that rows men home," a line that takes on eerie resonance knowing his tablets literally floated him to safety. The fishermen who found him didn't just rescue a man, they salvaged a worldview, one where beauty and survival weren't opposites, but partners in the dance against oblivion. Modern science lends unexpected weight to this ancient anecdote. Studies on shipwreck survivors show that those who engage in structured mental tasks, navigation, journaling, even singing, have higher survival rates than those paralyzed by panic. The rhythm of poetry, with its predictable beats and repetitions, may have functioned like a cognitive life raft, keeping Alkias' mind above water even as his body faltered. His story forces us to reconsider what counts as a survival skill. We stockpile flashlights and canned goods, but how many of us think to pack the songs, stories, or rituals that might anchor us when the world floods? The tablets themselves became relics displayed in temples as proof of Apollo's favor. But their true legacy isn't in marble or myth, it's in the radical idea they represent. When Alkias pressed stylus to wax in that maelstrom, he proved something timeless. That survival isn't just about muscle or luck. Sometimes it's about the fragile, stubborn act of making meaning when meaning threatens to dissolve. 5 centuries later, another poet, Ovid, would write from exile that song cannot be silenced by water or sword. He might as well have been etching Alkias' epitaph. The sea took the ship, but the words walked ashore, and in that walking, they taught us that the most human thing we do isn't just to endure, but to sing while we're drowning. From the scorching sands where lost legions vanished to the frozen peaks where the last Neanderthals made their final stand, these 25 stories aren't just about survival, they're about reinvention. Each one forces us to redefine what it means to endure. Was it the castaway drinking turtle blood on Ascension Island, the hidden Christians preserving faith in whispers, or the lone Viking in Greenland who traded his sword for a sealskin coat? These weren't just people outlasting disaster, they were alchemists turning desperation into ingenuity, fear into defiance. What unites them all isn't luck, but a refusal to accept the ending they were handed. The survivors of Thera didn't just flee their sinking island. They carried its memory like a seed, planting it in foreign soil. The deserters of Alexander's army didn't just escape, they built new identities in the shadows of the Hindu Kush. Even in the bleakest moments, they found levers to move the world. A wax tablet floating on the waves, a hollowed-out book hiding scripture, a child's toy clutched in a frozen hand. These weren't miracles, they were choices, small, stubborn acts of agency that stacked the odds in their favor. The real lesson here isn't just about physical endurance. It's about the flexibility of the human spirit. The Batavia mutiny survivors didn't triumph because they were stronger than their tormentors, but because they were more united. The last Neanderthals in Gibraltar didn't cling to the past. They adapted their tools to a changing world. Survival, these stories scream, is never passive. It's creative, it's collaborative, it's the quiet understanding that sometimes you must shed your old skin to keep breathing. So which tale resonates with you? The rebel queen who might have outwitted Rome, or the slave who turned his escape into legend? Drop your answer in the comments. We're endlessly fascinated by the threads that connect us to these survivors. And if you're hungry for more stories where humanity stares down the impossible, hit subscribe. History's greatest mysteries aren't just about what was lost. They're about what refused to die, because when the desert swallows an army or the ice claims a city, one truth remains. As long as there's someone left to remember, the story isn't over.